Occupation and Meditation from Narvik to Ukraine, how writing an historical war movie can bring meditative insights. And the basis for this webinar, there are two experiences. One is the process of writing this movie, which took, well, was engaged in the project for approximately 3 years of my life. And then the second experience is 31 years of teaching Ake meditation on my spare time. So whatever I'm saying today is somehow based on these two experiences. All right. And the question I would like to raise tonight is it possible to avoid the deterioration of our societal values 3 generations after a devastating war? And we will come at this from different angles. We will start with the micro and local level, which is based on some personal experiences related to writing the movie. And then we will look at the bigger picture, which is the societal and the nation state level. And then at the end, we will try to say something about the existential level in this. So from a personal experience to something a bit more, not necessarily speculative, but at least, you know, we're allowing yourself to think a bit bigger. Okay, so the first chapter then is the micro and the local level. And I'll call that chapter The Script That Didn't Work. So we'll start with this picture. And what is this? Well, first of all, I think most of us see that this is a building being hauled on a truck. And then there are some clues in this picture that we might deduct things from. I'd say this is probably Scandinavia from the look of the
Christopher, are you still there? Christopher.
There were 2 gentlemen in gilets jaunes in yellow vests, and they are carrying cameras of professional nature, which means that this is probably an event that has some kind of interest to the general public and to the press. And then there's a blue banner, and the blue banner on the building gives the whole thing away for those people who are initiated, so to speak. It says LKAB, LKAB. And that is the name of the company who are mining, which is mining iron ore in the Swedish town of Kiruna. And why on earth are this company moving a big wooden building? Well, the thing is that to the left on this picture, the down left, you see the daybreak part of the iron ore mines in Kiruna. And as they progress, the ore goes deeper and deeper into the ground. And that means that a larger area around the mines will be more volatile and more susceptible for cracking. So quite a few years ago, Kiruna municipality decided that they will take the trouble by moving the city center from the white stippled area to the red stippled area. And this is an old illustration. They are now, as you saw from the former picture, in the process of doing so. And the question is, of course, why bother moving a city center? Well, it must be because the quality of the iron ore in the Kiruna mine are superior. They have an international edge. They are sought after. So that expense is worth taking. And then if we look at the inlet, the map, you can see that Kiruna is marked in red up in northern Sweden. And then I will ask you, if you are to ship high quality iron ore from Kiruna to the international market, what will you do? Of course, the most efficient thing is to ship it by boats. Will you then transport it by train to the Baltic Sea and then go all the way down and around Sweden and around Denmark and then go into the international shipping lanes? Or would you rather take and transport the iron ore directly to the west and come out to some kind of deep water port right beneath the islands of Lofoten and Vesterålen, which you see protruding from the Norwegian coast as some kind of movement or beak going out. And of course, that's what the Swedish company did. They built a railroad to Narvik port that was finished some 120 years ago. And now there is about up to 26 trains a day thundering with this high quality iron ore being transported from Kiruna. So if we look at the closer picture, you will see Kiruna municipality down here. And then there's the train line is not drawn on the map, but it kind of follows the yellow road to the port town of Narvik. And Narvik as a town was built for this sole purpose, to transport iron ore to the world. And there you go out Ofotfjorden, and you have directly access to the international shipping lanes. So this is the kind of physical, concrete, economical background for the movie and for this situation where the Kiruna municipality are moving houses. Okay. In the late 1930s, as Hitler was preparing to invade Poland, 85% of the Nazi steel, the steel that the Nazis used to produce their war machine, came from Sweden. So obviously, this was a very central source. It was of paramount interest to secure the supply of this high quality iron ore for the ambitions that Hitler had at the time. And one guy who knew that very well was this gentleman. He is not a Quisling, he is the Quisling. He was the leader of the Norwegian National Gathering Party, which was the Norwegian Nazi party. And he was well aware, there was a labor government in Norway in the late 30s. And of course, he was an ambitious man, and he was very taken by the ideology of this gentleman, Adolf Hitler. And so after Hitler had invaded Poland in the 1st of September 1939, he gathered his things together. He got a silver copy of the Viking ship Oseberg made, and he traveled to Berlin on the 18th of December. He met finally with Hitler, and he said, "Dear Mr. Hitler, please take Narvik now." Hitler had no plans to secure the Norwegian coastline and the iron ore at that point, but the result of Hitler's visit, Quisling's visit to Hitler, was of course that the whole plan was bumped up. So that made an impact, that meeting, the 18th of December. In the meantime, war was declared between Britain and the Allies and Germany. So Churchill on his side in Great Britain, he had his own plans, because he was also dependent upon the iron ore coming from Narvik. So he had gathered quite a large expeditionary force of some 28,000 men, and they were residing in a little fjord in the Orkney Islands, Scapa Flow, the marine base there. And his plan was, because the Winter War had broken out just before between Finland and the Soviet Union. So his plan was to help the Finns fight the Bolsheviks by transporting this expeditionary force to Narvik and then send them via the train to Finland to help out. And by the way, he would just leave some forces behind in Narvik to see to that, you know, the Brits and the Allied had control of this iron ore. Unfortunately, this plan was thwarted by the fact that there was a peace between the Soviet Union and Finland in March 1940. And then Churchill somehow lost his fig leaf. So the idea for him was, and that was still on the ropes after the peace in Finland, was to see to that the war, the theater of war between the Nazis and the Allies would be in Scandinavia. So that's the idea was then that we would somehow shield Central Europe and Great Britain, for that sense, from the war that everybody knew would be coming. So that was his plan, of course. And so the expeditionary force, it stayed in Scapa Flow, ready to move also after the peace in the Winter War. Okay, so Hitler already had a plan devised, and he sped up that plan. And then it was called the Weserübung. And the 9th of April, 1940, there was a timed attack with ships leaving Germany at specifically planned intervals, so that the ships would enter all the targets at the same time, 5:15 in the morning. And the northernmost target was the most important for the Weserübung. It was Narvik, the port of Narvik, to secure the control of the iron ore. So the whole of Weserübung was, the secondary target was to secure the strategic coastline in Norway. The primary target was to get the iron ore. Okay, so that's more or less where the movie Narvik starts. Here we see part of the opening sequence of the movie. We have what is a digital model of the old Narvik port imposed then on the landscape. We see the pride of the Norwegian Navy, which was the battleship Norge, and they had a twin battleship, which was just outside view here, called Eidsvoll, named after the site for the Norwegian Constitution. And these two ships were the pinnacle of the Norwegian Navy. And they were built in 1900, and they were now 40 years old, and they should have been decommissioned after World War I. And so this was what the Norwegians had to kind of counter this Weserübung invasion with. And they were downed during the first 30 minutes of the Germans entering the basin of Narvik. And also Norway was clinging to its neutrality in the war. That was the line that it followed in the World War I. So we had neutrality guards, not really soldiers, but they were there to, see to that Norway wouldn't be offended by any of the warring nations. And our male character in the movie, he is serving his duty as a neutrality guard. Okay. And then to the story that triggered this webinar. This is the picture of the two central characters of the movie. He has been home, allowed by his major to come home and visit his son's birthday. And of course, he stays with his wife the night. He oversleeps, and the wife wakes up from the blast in the port from the Norge being downed by the Germans. And he realizes he's in deep trouble and he has to go back. And the way it plays out in the movie, it's kind of a sweet scene, and there's a lot of love and gentleness between them. In the script that I provided to the casters, when you cast a movie, that means you find the actors and you try out different actors and you have them act against each other. In that version of the scene, there was a high level of conflict, where she said, you can't leave us now. The town is threatened. You have to be here and protect our family. Well, he says, it is my duty to go back to my unit and defend my country as I am supposed to do. So that was the conflict that was written in the scene that was given to the casters. And these are young actors. They are in their first half of their 20s. And once the director took that scene to the casters, I got the following feedback. Chris, your script does not work. Well, I dare say the scene did work. You need a clear conflict. There was a clear conflict. It's not difficult to play the scene. Well, the director said, none of the actors understood why he has to leave. None of the actors understood why he would leave his family in such a situation and go back to his unit in order to protect his country. From shattering experience. Of course, you never want to hear that your scenes don't work. But what is worse for me was to realize that the generations that follow after me, they don't get the situation at all. For me, it was an obvious situation. And then it might be related to what happens, as I talked to in the introduction to this, these three generations. Because here we have the entrance to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland, a Nazi camp, one of the annihilation camps where people were shipped in via trains, and then they used cyclone gas on them. And here you see two people taking selfies in front of the Arbeit macht frei entrance, which is kind of a famous entrance. And then if you're not happy with that, you can go into the museum, and of course you can take a selfie with the guy responsible for the activities. And if you're not happy with that, you can go to the famous train portal into the camp, where these people were shipped in cattle wagons in order to be annihilated. And you can have your friend take a nice pose picture of you. I'm putting this to a point. I don't know whether there's a connection between the actors' lack of ability to understand what was at stake in the scene and to what is expressed through these pictures. But somehow they might be an indicator of the same, of what happens when you remove yourself 3 generations away from a devastating war. And again, these are thoughts. I'm not sure about these things. In the best case, it indicates this distance, that there's this distance between me and the event. There's distance between me and the people who lived through the war. And at the same time, if we look then at this journey from Second World War until today, and we look at it from a generational perspective. And we have this statement that, of course, the male main character of Narvik was presented to: you shall sacrifice yourself for your country. And then you can make an axis where we have the generations along the x-axis, and we have the intensity of whatever we're stating on the y-axis. And we'll start then to look at the generations. We have the greatest generation, which is the G.I. Joe generation. These are the people who actually fought in World War II. Then you have the silent generations, which is a generation that came just immediately after World War II. And Joe Biden is the first American president belonging to that generation. Then you have the baby boomers, also called the 68ers, which came directly after the silent generation. And then you have the Gen X generation that I belong to, which is born 1970 plus minus. And then you have the millennials, which came into adulthood around the year 2000. And then you have the Gen Zers, which are the people born from 2000 and onwards. And then you have the people born today, the Generation A. And if we then return to this, you shall sacrifice yourself for your country, then one answer is yes, Major, of course. And that would be the attitude that I would expect from the young gentleman in the Narvik movie. And if you then trace the, let's say, the adherence to that statement throughout the generations, you might have a movement like this. For the 2 first generations after the war, you have a high accordance with it. And then you have the baby boomers who were not very excited about war. They were excited about other things. And then you have the Gen Xers who might, as a reaction to their parents, then say, all right, we'll do our duty here. And then again, this is just speculation. The will to sacrifice yourself for your country then recedes quite considerably throughout the generations. And then we can contrast that axis with another axis, which is anti-authoritarian idealism. And if we draw that, it might somehow invert the other axis. So it's not that necessarily that these generations that don't score high on the yes major curve, that they're not engaged, that they don't have values, but that their values are rather anti-authoritarian. So the boomers are a very good example of that. The 68ers, the 68 rebellion in Paris was an anti-authoritarian rebellion against Charles de Gaulle. In US, it was the resistance to the Vietnam War that really marked this generation. Make love, not war. The Gen Xers are named as an ironic generation. And I think the irony partly came out as a reaction to the intense engagement of their parents. So they were more like, well, more postmodern in the sense that whatever, you can joke with everything. And then throughout the millennials and the Gen Zers, there's an increased engagement in the contemporary. This can be exemplified by Greta Thunström, the young Swedish lady that says, "How dare you?" and who has made it as her main course to fight the stupidity of older people because they have destroyed the planets and they are, bringing Untergang, downfall for all of us. And of course, there is something good in this engagement, but it also, as it is often with this kind of idealism, it's also a simplification. Well, you can, it's easy to agree to the fact that you should make love and not war. And it's easy to agree to the fact that we should stop the global warming. But once you confront the realities, for instance, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, things become more complex. So these lines, they are touched by this event of February 22, of Putin invading Ukraine. And of course, we had a little ping on that radar when he went into Crimea and wasn't stopped. But this time, he's being stopped, and we're in the middle of that war now. And we have young people fighting for Western democracy and values on the front line against the Russian invading forces. So what this will do with these generations and their attitude towards the idea of defending your country, well, the jury is still out on that. And before we round off this chapter, I'll just point to one more component in this kind of development, which is the extreme polarization of Western society. And of course, everything starts in America and is more accentuated in America. But the poles that we see, they are also represented in the European societies, which is the far right and the far left facing off the authorities one way or another. So both these rebellions, the defund the police, the wokeism, and the Trump populism is somehow an attack on the establishment. The system that is there now is not right. So if you look at the lines, it talks into the anti-authoritarian part of this movement. But in essence, both movements are anti-democratic. They are undermining the liberal democracies in the way that the mature dialogue, the mature conversation about how to solve your issues in society is ripped apart, and you're just standing and you're screaming at each other. So we have a society in war with its own values. And that also might be a result of this disconnection, this movement, these generations that have passed since the last devastating war. So in a way, we might say that Putin's invasion of Ukraine can be looked upon as a wake-up call for Western liberal democracies. it is a return to a higher conscience about what is the basis for our lives and the quality of it. The ability to, within fairly limits, be able to say what you mean publicly and not being collected by the police in the middle of the night, sent to some gulag. So the values that the GI generation, the people in the Narvik movie, died for are somehow seen as being in decline, and then this invasion comes, and then you remembered, oh, right, okay, this is the actual world. This is the reality. Okay. So that was the micro level. Then we're going one level up. We're going to look at the societal and national level. And then I'm going to be personal with you. I'm going to tell a personal story from my life and my family. Now we have to pay attention. It's called Granddad Under the Bridge. And Granddad, that's my mother's father. He's here in a gray suit in the middle of the picture. He was trained a pilot. And he was part of the kind of pioneerish airplane movement in Norway, or whatever you call it, flight movement in Norway. He also then served as a neutrality guard in one of these planes, which was what the Norwegian Air Force at the time were supplied with. It's a Dutch plane called Fokker. And he had a Fokker parked with, I think, with floats on it in a lake just next to my house here in Bogstadvannet. So when the Germans arrived, the Nazis arrived in Oslo the 9th of April, he ran to Bogstadvannet and he took this plane and he flew north in order to seek out the government to see if he could help them. But he just came a little while up, and then he was shot upon by Norwegian forces at Minnesund. And then he flew under this bridge to get away from the friendly fire that was attacking him. And then he proceeded to Hamar, where he landed the boats and spoke to the government. And every time I drive past Minnesund with my children, I tell this story about my granddad, who did this crazy stunt of flying a Fokker under the Minnesund Bridge. And I see it as part of, the myth. Every family have their myths, and this was part of my family's myth. And then yesterday I asked my children, who was this guy? And then it was, well, yeah, wasn't he like our great-great-granddad or something, So again, we have this distance. I thought that, because I grew up with these stories, and the part what inspired my interest for historical stories and for war stories. So for me, he's a living person, but they never met him. So of course they don't have a relationship to him in the same way. And then Minnesund Bridge, where is this bridge? Who was this guy? It's all a blur for them, understandably. But then I asked, what kind of person was he? And then they went, well, he must have been some kind of a hero. And I say, why? Well, okay. They started reflecting upon the fact, well, is it heroic to fly under the bridge? Yes, it is. It's kind of cool, but he did that to save himself, but it was for a greater good, etc. So it's kind of a complex picture. What is interesting with my granddad is that, as I said, he belongs to the G.I. Joe generation, and he proceeded to go to Scotland and then served in training Norwegian pilots. And the Fokker planes, they were used in the campaign against the Nazi forces during the Battle of Narvik as well. But he proceeded and also did a lot of airplane work, among other things, in mapping the Antarctic continent. So he served also science through his work further on. And down to the left, you see the peak that is named after my granddad, the Fris Båstad Peak, and it is on Antarctica. If you see the inlet to the left, you recognize the feature protruding to the north in the upper section of the Antarctic landscape. So it's in the section called Dronning Mauds Land, and you find the Fris Båstad Peak. I don't know if he did this out of duty or whether he was an adventurer, but at least he contributed with his training as a pilot to some kind of common project. Well, that being a point in this second section of this webinar. Yeah, here you see the area. Okay, so if we then turn to the historian Harari, who has written several books, and this perspective is from a book called Homo Deus. He talks about the task of the nation states. And the task of the nation state can be said it is to protect its population and itself against three big threats: hunger, plague, and war. These are the three never-ending threats to human society. And when I wrote the Narvik movie, and when the young actors were presented with a scene that they could make no sense of, none of these three elements were present in their mind. As we proceed, we come to February, March 2020. Principal photography of the Narvik movie has just started. We're shooting, camera, actors, blocking off parts of cities, doing all these things, the kind of myth of making movies. After 1 week of shooting, plague hits. And the whole production is shut down and postponed. And there's a big trouble starting for this movie. It has a long, long, cumbersome process towards its release finally this year. And then as the movie is finally finished and it needs to go up in the cinema so that all the people who invested in it can get their money back, Putin invades Ukraine. The premiere is postponed, and war is suddenly on the top of at least the European mind. And the world also discovers that it is dependent on the grain supply coming from Ukraine and Russia through the shipping lanes in the Black Sea. So hunger was then all of a sudden also a reality. Maybe not for the privileged people in the Western democracy, but for people in Africa, definitely. For instance, a major supply of calories in Egypt is grain coming from Ukraine. So after all these years, all these generations of thinking that the world was a good place, it still is in its own way, but that we would be shielded from these three great threats. All of a sudden, within a time span of 2 years, it's all brought up again, and we realize what is the kind of reality underneath the surface of our existence and our societies. Okay, if we relate that to my granddad and the GI generation, and this project of protecting itself and humankind from these three great threats, you can imagine then if you were given an education as a scientist, as a doctor, as an engineer, or as an officer, as a leader, it would be so that you were given that education in order to support the nation state in its mission to protect its people and itself from these great three threats. But if you ask at least the younger generations before February 2022 and the invasion, they would have the following perspective, mostly. I'm not saying it's for all, but I think there's a change there in attitude. where the nation state is there to support my self-realization project. That's the way that I see the world. I am to realize myself, and the government is to support that. And of course, it's a good situation to be in, but in a time of crisis with war, hunger, and plague, you will be asked to do service for your nation again. You could say a lot about this slide, because there's also, we've seen, it's controversial, but we've seen throughout the pandemic also that the levers of power, the nation states' will to control individuals has been used quite hardly in one way. And the jury is still out on whether it was this necessary, when in retrospect we see, was it necessary to close down society so harsh? China paid a big price, other societies as well. So, you know, the nation state can also still today be imposing itself on the individual, but along other axes than the axis that we are talking about here, regarding my the flight education of my granddad and the kind of perspective that at that point was relating these three great threats. Okay. So for the final lap of this webinar, we will try to look at an even bigger picture, or a deeper picture somehow, which is the existential level. And again, I will present you with a little personal story to start with. This is called The Story of the Little Person. And here we have an opening shot from the movie. This is the main character walking down the main street of Narvik. Narvik doesn't exist, so this is another town, another place. The snow wasn't there, so it was brought in by trucks, etc., etc. This is, you know, the faking of movies. What is interesting to our purpose for this webinar is this character over here. It's one of the extras crossing the street dressed up as a child anno 1940 in April. And this character came into the world some 16 years ago. And in the beginning, this character was just called the little person, while her parents were kind of trying to find out, who are you and what name would suit you? And so the little person was called the little person for some months. She was born very early in the year, early in January. So we were like trendsetters, I would say. We would be one of the first parents naming a child in this new year. And we found a name that we knew nobody had. And we were very proud. We thought we were original when we, we sent our little person out in the world with a unique and special name to match her unique and special character. And then if you look at the statistics for this period, and you look to the area of Oslo, which is marked by a little green dot in the bottom of the Norwegian map, you find that the name we chose for our little person was one of the most popular names, and the most popular one in Oslo that year. So what on earth is going on? We did not broadcast to the world this name. So why did it become the most used girl's name in Oslo that year? What kind of process lies under this? What governs the fluctuations of names? Well, one gentleman that has given a tentative answer to that was the psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. And he talks about the common unconscious. So his thought is that exists something, a collective, universal, and impersonal psychology that is rooted in all of us, and it is a source of intuitive knowledge of the world, and it's kind of inherited through the generations. And if you think about this concept, it makes sense to explain things. And of course, the Jungian common unconscious is a familiar concept. And you could use it to explain why, for instance, myths all over the world tend to resemble each other. But you cannot, it's very hard to scientifically prove any of Jung's theories on this area, because you cannot give a person a questionnaire and say, okay, the action that you did there, was it governed by a collective, universal, and impersonal psychology? Yes or no? Okay, here's the proof, etc. So Jung's theory is controversial in that sense. And if you start questioning yourself about the common unconscious, there are a lot of interesting aspects to it. How is it updated? Does it reside in our genes, or does it reside elsewhere? And there directly we move towards the mystical and towards the metaphysical. So these are kind of, he gives names to something that is a phenomenon that you can register somehow, like with the names of the little person. But at the same time, it's hard to have any kind of scientific knowledge about it. But it is an interesting concept. And the idea, of course, is also that events in the contemporary, they shape this common unconscious. Because from that perspective, we share some kind of common reality on a deeper level. And then, of course, events like World War II would probably leave a mark on this common unconscious. We look at the statistics on conflicts after World War II and to 2020, which is how far this data sheet is taken. We can see that there's a very steep decline in the conflicts in the world. So the world has, until 22 and the invasion of Ukraine, in terms of number of conflicts, been very powerfully reduced, and the death toll, which is this a measure of, has gone down. So in that sense, the collective trauma of people has been reduced. If we say that the people's death is a traumatic event on a big scale, it has been reduced during this period. So we'll see now then for the Ukrainian war. So in that perspective, it's probably a good thing for humankind that we have had a period of relative peace. And you see the purple spikes is first the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. Was interesting, just briefly, as we're closing in towards the end of this webinar, if you look at fiction, since I'm talking about the experience of this movie, the more you remove yourself from World War II, the more graphic and the more brutal the movies become in their depiction of the violence going on. So in the first war movies that came out in the 50s and the 60s, when someone was shot, he or she just fell to the ground. Now today, it's blood splatter on the lens, it's handheld camera, we're into the gore, we delve deeper into this brutality. So it is as if these two lines, reduced brutality in the world and increased brutality in fiction, at least they correlate oppositely. And then just a brief look also then on the casualties in the Ukrainian war towards the 1 year mark, the 365 days. These are estimates, and these estimates are based on loss of material, of vehicles. So it's kind of hard to assess, but it gives you an idea that, again, the purple columns of our chart there is now on the rise again on quite a large scale. So this carnage is now going on. And of course, from one perspective, Ukrainian soldiers have the right to shoot Russian aggressors, but still the act of taking a life and the act of killing and people dying in itself might leave some kind of mark on this, if we accept the idea of this collective Jungian subconscious or unconscious. And then there's another aspect. I'm just going to throw that in there towards the end. That's a line that you can look, you can find it at the end of American movies. No animals were harmed during the making of this film, which might be true. And they have agents from the American Animals Protection Association representing on set during the shooting to see to that everything is going okie dokie. And then, of course, you take a break and you go and you have a Hollywood burger in the middle of the shooting. So no animals might not be harmed, but, well, you just killed one. And then just to throw that in, again, I don't know whether Jung includes animals in his common unconscious, or whether the animals are out of this mix. But again, if we look at it in a more, whole perspective, the killing of animals might also influence the level of brutality in the world. And here you can see the steep rise in at least, especially pig consumption, but also in other meats in the period from 62 until 2018. So the killing in war is going down, the killing of pigs is going up. And I think part of this rise is also the Chinese realizing the pleasure of eating bacon. And an estimate then somewhere north of 3 billion animals are slaughtered every year in order to provide the world with these proteins. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just holding it up there saying, okay, this might also be an aspect in this. All right. So we looked at then this interesting kind of axis, but war is brutalizing experience, but it kind of connects you to the realities of existence and the foundation for a society, whereas the disconnection is a safe place to be. It leads to selfies like this, but you lose track of the values of your society, and it might lead to decline over time. So there's a kind of an opposition between these two elements. And then, as this is a webinar based on these two experiences with writing a war movie and also teaching meditation, it's okay just to dwell towards the end now on the meditative impulse. So meditation is a personal tool. It works on the individual level. It helps you be more connected to yourself, and through that also connect more to the people around you. It helps you to embrace and accept whatever situation you are in. It gives you access to more of your own resources. It can help you walk through traumas in your history. And it helps you strengthen your existential platform, helps you be more in touch with who you are, what is important for me, what is my direction, how do I use whatever resources I have to realize myself and to do something good in the world. So that's an individual level. If we then look at the collective level, again, without being speculative, you might say that if you have individuals in a culture connected more to themselves, that will also result in increased connection in the culture. If you are trained at embracing accepting situation, you will also create a society with greater tolerance. And if you have more access to resources, if you have more contact with who you are and how you would like to express yourself, that will lead to a more honest public dialogue. And if you as an individual work through your traumas, you reduce the overall trauma level in society. And if you have a strengthened existential platform, then maybe society as a whole might have also a stronger ethical compass. Okay. And then the last person you'll meet is this young lady, and she is probably the age of the young actors in the Narvik movie, not coming to terms with the script of this young man going into war. She's one of many young Ukrainian women serving just behind the front lines as a paramedic, patching up people who have been shelled or shot. And that's quite a job, and she's on the front line for our society's values at the moment, for the liberal democracy in the eastern Ukraine. And one of her colleagues were asked, what, if you could do anything in the world right now, what would you like to do? I would like to sleep for 2 weeks, and then I would like to watch Netflix, was her answer. And of course, for those of us who have a Netflix subscription, it makes you realize that even that is a privilege in a time of war. All right. So I started out by asking, is it possible to avoid this deterioration of the societal values throughout the generations after war? Have I answered that question? No, not really. I'm a writer, so I kind of reserve that privilege to be the one asking questions. We have seen that distance and growth might create leniency and ignorance towards the basic values. But we've also seen that there is a complex picture with a large number of factors. It could be the level of conflicts in your country that decides whether you still kind of cherish these values over a longer time. It seems as if economic instability and growth makes you more lenient, make you take things more for granted, unfortunately. I'm not sure about this. It seems also that the more you elongate yourself from a devastating war where these values kind of were in play, the more the internal conflict level in a culture springs up, like we see in the extreme right and extreme left. And as a complicating factor that hasn't been there as much before, we also now have the challenge with the climate changes and the revolution that we're just starting now that will change our lives and our children's lives fundamentally, which is the AI revolution. So these are all factors, contributing and probably more to this kind of removing from the core values and this kind of essence of protecting ourselves against the plague, the hunger, and the war. And as I've tried to say at the end, meditation might help in this movement throughout the arguments that I brought. And then, of course, it's the call to action button. Why don't you enroll to begin this course now? All right. So that was what I was going to say today.